Welcome to the Scale the Chaos podcast, where we talk all things contributing to your organization's chaos and dysfunction. I'm Rhonda Lea, founder and owner of Scale the Chaos. Today's guest is Dr. John O'Brien, an incivility expert whose book, Rudeness Rehab, was just released on October 8th. Are you aware of any hidden or long-term costs to the workplace incivility? Because I know there are some leaders who really respond well to specific numbers, right? They want to
Yes.
know, how much is this costing me? So,
Yes.
do we have any kind of research or numbers on that?
I can't cite specific research on this exact number, but I can
Mhm.
talk more generally about what are some of the costs in
Okay.
general.
Okay.
For example, if we think about the um, productivity costs,
Hmm.
right, when you have a toxic work culture and how you have employees who aren't really engaged with their work, who aren't being as productive as they could be, who don't feel comfortable sharing their opinion, there are productivity and profitability costs built
Hmm.
into that.
Yep.
Then think about if someone has been distracted by stuff going on in the workplace, they may be out sick more often.
Yes.
They may engage in quiet quitting while they're looking for a different job. You
Yes.
have the associated costs when you have to replace that person of onboarding
Yep.
someone else and the search that you need to do.
Yep.
So there's a whole lot of costs that are embedded in the personnel issues that
Yes.
are associated with incivility.
Absolutely. And most people are fully aware of those retention costs. If you're losing employees because of incivility and rudeness, especially good employees, highly
Yes.
productive employees who can go somewhere else. Not that I'm saying if you have employees you don't think can go anywhere else, that they're free game, right? But especially if you have these highly productive employees who can go somewhere else, they will.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think, unfortunately, my experience in coaching individuals, I hear about these situations where there is a lot of toxicity
Hmm.
and people are leaving,
Yeah.
but people further higher up in the organization aren't really showing interest or examining, wait, there's a pattern here.
Hmm.
People, this
Yeah.
person's direct reports are leaving, and we're getting
Yeah.
like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And that sometimes it just takes one person in one department to really be the bad apple, so to speak, or
Yeah.
poisoning the well. Again, not even necessarily with intention, but just with stress-related negative behaviors, but that are spreading toxicity.
Yeah. And when you think about it, if you are allowing a culture turning your good employees away, and really that means all you have left are those employees who honestly can't find another job,
Yes.
right? Then
Mhm.
all you're left with are a bottom of the barrel employees that can't find a job anywhere else. They're unemployable. And that's all you end up having on your workforce if you allow things like this to continue. Does that make sense?
And it does when people have more skills or have more talent, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're the ones that are going to go,
Yeah,
that they can vote with their feet and leave. Whereas
exactly.
other people, whether it's in terms of resources they have or confidence level, they don't feel like they have
Yeah.
the confidence to go elsewhere.
Yep.
They're the ones that end up staying
Yeah.
and put up with the behavior.
Yeah. And when your workforce is made up predominantly of those types of people, that's going to hit the bottom line really quick.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's one individual contributor or one administrator and leader
Hmm.
that is causing so many people to be leaving,
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely. So, in your research, have you found that there's any industries that the rudeness tends to be more prone to?
Of course, I don't want to necessarily just trash certain
Right. I
industries,
understand.
you know,
Yeah.
but I can tell you in the experiences that I've had, I think healthcare is
Hmm.
one. It's one area that I've done a lot of work in, and that I think for many years, quote, bad behavior on the part of especially physicians and some surgeons
Hmm.
who were really gifted surgeons.
Yeah.
You didn't really necessarily need them to have a great bedside manner because
Hmm.
you just needed them to operate on people who weren't conscious and do
Right.
a good
Yeah.
job. And so I think healthcare organizations felt like they didn't need to be concerned
Hmm.
about how that surgeon was treating other people.
Yes.
But now understanding that surgery is not just about the surgeon, but about the team and how many errors happen as a
Yes.
result of incivility,
Hmm.
that type of behavior is not being tolerated anymore.
Yes.
So healthcare is one. I've worked a lot also with attorneys,
Hmm.
and my experience in working with attorneys as a coach and having been involved in some legal proceedings as an expert witness, attorneys' worlds are about conflict
Yes.
and they have to be
Yes.
in conflict. And that's the reality. But I think sometimes people in that field have failed to see that you can be in conflict and you can be pushing back and forth, but it doesn't have to be rude. It can be assertive, but not rude. And I
Uh-huh.
think that type of rude and uncivil behavior was tolerated or even seen as being a good defense or
Yes.
a good advocate. But that's also starting to change,
Uh-huh.
where sometimes as a result of rude behavior on the part of an attorney, that they're actually getting fined
Yes.
in the court system for that. So
Hmm.
that's those are two industries I have seen specifically,
Okay.
but I think that's changing for the good, for the better.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So as remote work starts becoming more and more common, although I know some companies are starting to pull back from that, but it's still very common, right?
Yes. Yes.
So how has the remote work increased or changed the landscape of work and civility and rudeness?
That's a great question and a really important one
Mhm.
because it is much easier to engage in uncivil behavior when whoever is the target of the uncivil behavior, someone you don't know. So that's where it comes in social media. People feel really comfortable being
Yes.
really nasty to
Yes.
others that they
Yes.
have no social connection with.
Yes.
Now, when you have a social connection through a work environment,
Hmm.
is much easier to write something nasty in an email or in the
Hmm.
chat than it is to say it to someone's face.
Yes.
The other thing is, and I certainly will admit, I found this to be true myself, is we were in that lockdown
Uh-huh.
status for a good period of time, and then getting back out into the world and being like, "Oh, I got to interact with people. And like, how do I do this? And like social interactions. And so I think that got people out of the habit of how to do it. And I think with remote work, when people are in their little foxhole
Hmm.
still, some people are fully remote.
Yeah.
They don't have that back and forth and connection that you can get by the water cooler, by
Yes.
getting a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And so that leads people, it's a less of a personal connection. And therefore, even in meetings like this, it's more personal, face to
Yes.
face, but it
Uh-huh.
still is being together in person. And people can still put stuff in the chat that's nasty.
Absolutely. Even a lot of organizations that I've worked for and with, even though it hasn't necessarily been remote, they've had some sort of inter-office chat, whether it be Teams or Slack or whatever. And you're literally slacking or sending messages to people who are like, I have sent Teams messages to people who are right outside my office door. And I find that even in the office experience, we're still becoming a little bit disconnected because
Yes.
I have received messages from people that I'm like, okay, if they were standing in my office right now, they would not have said that to me. And the irony is that most of these chat functions have been introduced or implemented with the idea of this will improve collaboration. This will improve communication because you can just quickly send somebody a message, which isn't helpful because you have no idea what that person is in the middle of doing and they get interrupted with messages. But that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
But these tools that these businesses are implementing with the idea of enhancing collaboration are actually not doing that. And so let's talk a little bit about some of those rude nuances in the office and maybe
Mhm.
even how they can be different, even if you're sitting in the same building, the same room, just a different cubicle or whatever, and you're messaging the person versus going and speaking to them in person.
Yes, again, it goes to what we were talking about before, which is it's so much easier to be inconsiderate when it's not
Face to
personal,
face. Yeah.
when it's not face to face, when it's just something in Slack. I think the other part of this, though, is that sometimes people react to things that they perceive as uncivil,
Yes.
that are not
Yes.
actually meant to be uncivil, but the person that sent it wrote something that perhaps could be interpreted a number of different ways.
Yes. Oh,
Um,
absolutely. Especially because over chat, there's no body language, there's no tone. So, for example, if I were to say something, normally I would say, hey, how is that project coming? But over text, it would literally say, how is that project coming? And it could be interpreted, depending on that person's inner voice, could be interpreted as quite direct. And I even found that issue because I tend to be more direct, but when I'm in person, I'm smiling and my tone, it's obviously that I don't mean anything negative by it. And I have to remind myself that when communicating over some sort of chat, I really have to set the tone with this good morning. How are you doing? I hope you had a good weekend. So they aren't immediately on the defensive. They are able to recognize my tone a little bit easier than if I just say, hey, how's that project coming?
Absolutely. Because, hey, how's that project coming? Could be perceived as I have to check up on you because you're a
Yes.
slacker,
Yes.
right? When you don't mean, you're just like, oh,
Yeah.
but
Hey,
exactly.
how's it coming? And maybe I should have said, is there anything that I can help you with? That probably would also help them realize I'm not trying to check up on you. I'm trying to see if you need help in that way, kind of thing.
Yeah. Or again, depending upon the environment, but saying, really appreciative of your efforts on this
Yes.
project. Just wanted to check to see where things stand for that. And if you need any help.
Yes.
It
Yes.
takes more effort,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Very
And some
intentional.
people are like, ugh. So now I got to write more words. I got to type more.
It's
But
so
if you,
inefficient.
yeah, but if you see that it matters,
Uh-huh.
because that helps to set the tone. Or
Yeah.
again, I remember when my students were like, because I was talking to students about the fact that you have to be careful about how you interpret words. And they were like, listen, Professor O'Brien, all you need to use is emoticons. And I was like, what? What are
Yes.
these? Why,
Yes.
like the younger generation.
Yes.
That can help, a little
Uh-huh.
smiley face or
Yes.
something, but that doesn't necessarily, can still get misinterpreted.
Yes. Yeah. And I even actually had some conversations because I manage some people in the younger generations. In my opinion, the emojis are less professional. So I'm like, they have no place in the workplace. However, if somebody sends me a message with an emoji, I'm not like, oh my gosh, but I generally don't use them. But I was literally told that I needed to use more emojis in my communication in order to soften it. And it was to soften how it's received because it wasn't intended in the way that it was received, but I guess in an easier way to communicate the intention, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that just really speaks to what we were talking about before, which is paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to not just your intent
Yes.
around an email, but the potential effect of an
Yes.
email.
Yes.
And you really have to try to think about how, so you have to start with how could this be interpreted negatively?
Yes. Yes.
Could it be interpreted negatively?
Yeah. And we all know those people who have no idea that sending it in all caps is yelling. I'm in that generation, like some of the younger generations, maybe if they aren't aware, oh, this person just doesn't know. Cause there's been a couple of times you receive one and you're like, I don't think this person realizes that all caps is yelling kind of thing. But yeah, also being aware because there were also some times where somebody sent me something like, hey, did you know this? And I just simply sent back 3 question marks because to me that communicated, I had no idea this is, or I'm confused, right? But to some of the younger generations, they were like, oh my gosh, this means you're questioning us, you're what it is that you're doing. As a matter of fact, my own children told me that when I text them and use punctuation, it freaks them out. They think they're in trouble. I'm like, what? It's just proper punctuation and grammar. And if I type out the full word, so it's funny. But at the same time, we need to be aware of that, right? We need to be aware of those generational differences and who it is that we're communicating with.
Absolutely. And I will acknowledge that I do sometimes for my students when I post announcements, I do write things in all caps, but I put in parentheses, I am very excited. I am not yelling,
Yes.
just to
Yeah.
put it in context so they know.
Yes.
But it does speak to the generational differences in
Yes.
what is perceived as uncivil,
Rude and yeah.
and that some of us in the older generation could say that generation just needs to toughen up.
Yes. Yeah.
But no, there's a middle ground, right?
Oh,
There's a middle
absolutely.
ground.
Absolutely.
And that,
Especially if you're wanting to be productive,
yes, yeah, exactly.
especially if that, because there was even a time where, and this was years ago, I haven't done this in a while, but I would start my emails with, hey, so and so exclamation. And I was trying to communicate that I was super excited to be talking with them. And other people perceived it as me being in their face. So as soon as I found that out, because it had never occurred to me, that's how it would be received. And so
Yes.
once that was communicated to me, I had to channel reserved Rhonda and just, Hi, so and so, comma. How are
Yes,
you today?
but what you were saying before, we were talking about the idea that you have to try to also be warm
Uh-huh.
in how you're greeting people. So you can't just say, "How's that coming?" You also have to find
Exactly.
some way to. So it's complicated, is what we're saying.
It
It's not
it
easy.
is. It is. It's very complicated. And not only does it differ from generation to generation, but it also differs from person to person, especially once you get to know the individual. As I was managing teams, I knew that there were certain people I could communicate in one way, and then other people I could communicate in another. And it would differ depending on their generation or just simply their personality type. Some of them are a little bit more reserved, and some of them are a little bit more less reserved is a way of saying it, right? Because I don't want to say aggressive because a lot of times aggressive is interpreted as negative, but they're just a little bit less reserved. And I knew they were the ones that I could say, hey, so and so, exclamation point, because they would respond in kind. Until you learn those nuances, there is this fine line of civility standard, right?
Yes. And do you mind if we just take a minute to talk about culture? Because
Oh,
I think that's really important. There are theories about that, like our language shapes our thinking
uh-huh.
and shapes our communication. And for many years, I've had good friends in Germany that I go to visit every year, and I consider myself not fluent now, but I've grown into being proficient in
Mm-hmm.
German.
Uh-huh.
But what I have learned in the process, no surprise, is that Germans are very direct. They're
Yes.
really direct.
Yeah.
And one of my friends who had a grandmother in Germany and a grandmother in the United States, she would say to her grandmother in Germany, Grandma, I hope you're alive the next time I visit. Now, you wouldn't say that to your grandmother in
No.
English, right? But that's just very like factual.
Yeah.
And there are lots of other examples, but my friends in Germany will laugh at me because even though I'm speaking German, I still am more indirect.
Yes. Yeah.
But then Germans come to the United States and they speak English
Yes.
and they still are very
Very
direct.
direct. Yes.
And there's that seen as rude where and that's a little bit curious for them because that's just how their culture.
Yeah.
And there are many other cultures that vary on the level of directness or indirectness. And so culture really matters.
Yes. I have a neighbor who is from another country because I don't want to say it out loud just in case they were to ever hear this podcast and know that I was talking about them. But they have come across as rather direct. And I have just chalked it up to that's their culture. And I chuckle and laugh. But there are other people, maybe it's because I'm a more direct person, so I don't find offense at it. But there's those other people who are less direct who just get completely bent out of shape over it. And I'm just like, you guys, you got to understand because maybe the way you communicate with her is offensive because you're not direct. It's not black or white. It's not,
Exactly.
there's not a right way or a wrong way necessarily to be civil. And it really does come down to the person, the individual, the circumstances, the culture, those nuances.
Yeah, and I would just add, going back to what you're saying before in terms of personality style, there is a personality characteristic around interpersonal sensitivity.
Uh huh.
Some people are more attuned to others,
Yes.
and some people in businesses are more attuned to whatever is the business objective.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean one's right and the other's wrong. There are different values and benefits of each style. But if people
Yes.
are less interpersonally sensitive, they're more likely than to be engaging in uncivil behavior without realizing it.
Yeah. And I think really it comes down to you adapt because you want to have productive conversations, right? Because there's always going to be those people who make the argument of why should I have to adapt? Why can't they adapt to me or whatever? And really, it comes down to okay, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Are you trying to meet an objective? Are you trying to get your needs met? And if you are, maybe this is a way to do that.
Absolutely. And depending upon your position, if you're the business leader, getting
Yes.
more out of your employees, you can say they should adapt to me.
Uh huh.
But if they're in the younger generation or they just have a different approach to
Yeah,
things, you have to try to figure out, or at least open the conversation about how to meet people part way.
absolutely. Yes.
But I do think, just to make the point, there are businesses, there are organizations, and I certainly have worked in some of them myself. Not all anybody listening to this that I've worked there, not every place I've worked, but some places I've
Right.
worked that just it didn't matter how much you tried to engage differently with other people, that it just was a toxic work culture or these were difficult people. And so the solution is you have to leave and you have to get support around leaving because not every situation is changeable, right? That you don't
Yes.
always
Oh,
have the power to
absolutely.
change it, right?
Absolutely. Especially those individual employees who maybe they've had a conversation with their manager or their manager's manager or HR. It
Right.
might be time to leave. So, what are some strategies that an organization can implement to prevent or reduce this incivility?
One of the things is that I really like what the Society of HR Management is doing. They've actually come out with an initiative around civility,
Okay.
and they're putting out a lot of, I think, really useful information and opening up that conversation, having leaders in the organization embrace that and talk about the importance of civility and
Mm-hmm.
model civility in their
Yes.
interactions with the people and in large group meetings. That I think really goes a long way in setting a tone in an organization
Uh-huh.
and deciding that civility is something that they want to emphasize and that incivility and rudeness isn't going to be tolerated, even
Yes.
if someone seems to be a valuable individual contributor.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some things that organizations can do at the larger level. And then also, I think, providing guidelines to managers and support and
Mm-hmm.
training for managers about what do you do when things start to
Yes.
unfold in a meeting that you're running and like how do
Yes.
you intervene?
I have worked with organizations that have had these no tolerance policies. I have seen these leaders put these non-tolerance policies in place, and they're the ones that ultimately have the decision of whether it's uncivil or not. And it almost gives them the power to be the only one that can be uncivil or rude.
Right. Exactly. Because they're the ones that are making the decisions and they can say that my behavior is fine. It's
Yeah.
other people's.
Yeah. My behavior is fine. You just interpret it. You're just insensitive, whatever it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Do you have any advice for individuals who find themselves on the receiving end of incivility?
Absolutely. Let's start with just generally, whether it's the
Okay.
workplace or your home space. When you're dealing with someone like you described, you have to step back and try to think about the context.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying that, okay, I need to think about the person's culture
Yeah.
or background or that what might their intention be? And ask yourself the question, how is whatever's going on not about me?
Mm-hmm.
How is this just about the way they are? Because obviously, if someone's rude to us, it immediately feels like a personal attack.
Yes.
And so trying to step back and be like, what else is going on in this person's life? Or how is it something about going on for them and not about me?
Yes.
It really depends upon, okay, is it a boss?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a peer? Is it a subordinate who's being uncivil? I've
Uh-huh.
certainly had managers who tolerate uncivil behavior from their direct reports because for whatever reason they're uncomfortable, they're not skilled in how to intervene. So
Yeah.
getting training on how to
How to
intervene
intervene. Yeah.
or how to deal with someone who's a peer in the organization, it's a challenge when it's someone who is a supervisor.
Yes.
And in those instances, I think it's important to get support from allies or other connections you have within the organization to ask about how to proceed with this person, get advice.
Uh-huh.
I always advise people it's important to have mentors or allies in your professional life outside your organization
Yes. Yes.
who can be sounding boards and give you advice that's more neutral.
Yes. Because they don't work for the same person. And yeah.
And sometimes people actually seek out the support of a coach. There's a chronic situation that they are
Yeah.
trying to deal with to get help with figuring out how to navigate that differently.
Uh-huh.
So I think figuring out what resources you need to gather to be able to get help. Certainly, sometimes people also go to HR. I've certainly heard people experience, and not to trash HR, because there are good psychologists
Yeah.
and it's not so effective, but sometimes people, depending upon the organization, don't feel like they can go to their
Yeah.
HR. So that's where having people outside the organization, but there are many HR departments that are really trying to change the tide
Yes.
in the organizations. And don't just make the assumption that HR can't be helpful because I think that a lot of times HR people can be great resources too.
Yeah, it depends on what the HR culture is. Some HRs, you can tell that they are very much there to protect the company.
Yes.
And that would be a situation where maybe you're not safe going to HR. But if you have the culture where HR is there to represent the employees, then might be a little bit safer
Yes,
to go to
absolutely.
HR. Okay, so what is the one thing you wish every leader understood about the impact of rudeness and incivility in the workplace?
I think I want to say two.
Okay, yeah. What are the two things?
I want to color outside the lines, Rhonda.
Okay, yeah.
One is that it's real and it matters.
Okay.
That sounds like two things, but that's one. But that leads to the idea that the leader sets the tone.
Yes.
What I saw always say is I'm not a big believer in trickle-down economics,
Mm-hmm.
but that isn't my expertise, so I'm not going to argue the point. But I'm a huge believer in trickle-down interpersonal dynamics.
Yes.
Many leaders underestimate their impact in the workplace
Yes.
and are not mindful about how their behavior is setting the tone. So incivility is real and it matters,
Mm-hmm.
and leaders can benefit from taking responsibility for setting the tone in their organization, and that really will make a difference.
Great. So, what are two or three strategies or tips that either business leaders or individual employees can implement today to help them in their rudeness rehab journey?
Think about that concept of the difference between the intent of your behavior and the effect of your behavior.
Okay.
Many people fail to understand, and whether it's in the form of an email or interpersonally, what's the effect of their behavior? So being open to understanding and reflecting on
Mm-hmm.
what's your impact,
Okay.
and actually, is that the impact that you want to have,
Yeah. I was going to
right?
say, what's the impact versus what it is you're trying to accomplish? And are they the same? Right.
Exactly, exactly. I guide people into thinking the two questions about when you get up in the morning, who do you want to be
Mm-hmm.
and what's really important?
Mm-hmm.
And using those, that's actually then leaking into tip number two. Think about those as your guiding principles for your day.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end of your day, you can stop and reevaluate, how did I do? How well did I adhere to the person that I wanted to be and really acting on what's important, not engaging in some of the struggles that get activated emotionally or some of the political stuff that we're seeing now.
Yes. Yes.
People get distracted because
Yes.
the reality is we're all in this together, whether it's as a church community or whether it's as an organization or as a country, as our society,
Yes.
reminding ourselves that we're all in this together.
Yes.
And some of this, all this other stuff is noisy distraction that's getting us away from the fact that we all want most primarily the same things, right?
Yes. And at the end of the day, as you reevaluate, knowing that maybe you didn't reach all of your goals, right? Maybe there you had some mess ups, but knowing the next day you can start over again and work towards those.
Yes. And that would be my last tip, which is to think about the idea of being compassionate with
Mm-hmm.
yourself.
Okay.
That I wrote this book, but I say right in the book, I'm not saying I'm perfect and I'm the expert. I'm a
Yeah.
work in progress, as we all are.
Yes.
So be gentle with yourself as you're on this journey, but get on the journey, please, because families, businesses, our society really needs to make a
Yes.
change in a better way.
And this is what the world needs.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
believe so too. Thank you so much for joining us, John. This was exciting. I enjoyed our conversation. And listeners out there, make sure you check out John's latest book, Rudeness Rehab, for more strategies and insights on rudeness rehab.
Yes,
And John,
indeed. Yeah.
where is it that they can find it?
Well, you certainly can find both the paperback version or the print version in Amazon. If you're more curious to find out more information about the topic in general, or to find a link to the purchasing the book, you can go to my website, rudeness.com. And if you're curious also about the work I do more generally in terms of professional speaking and coaching, you can find that at activatesuccess.org. So activatesuccess.org is for my coaching and professional speaking. And there's a link on there to rudenessrehab.com.
Awesome. And for more information on how you can scale the chaos in your organization, you can head on over to my website, scalethechaos.com. And you can also find more podcasts at scalethechaos.com/podcasts. I'm Rhonda Lea, and we'll chat more next time.